Tonight, Canadians left behind in Wuhan are on their way home.
While passengers on a sick cruise ship sit and wait.
We're missing out on just our everyday life.
Plus, why Beijing isn't back to normal.
Across Canada, the blockades, the disruptions, the arrests.
I've come to realize that asking for help is not a bad thing.
A troubling spike in mental health issues for Canadian farmers.
And Bernie Sanders on the rise.
Trump calls him a communist.
Trump calls a lot of people a lot of things.
He makes a lot of Democrats uncomfortable, but is he their best bet? This is The National.
6 weeks after the coronavirus emerged, some Canadians are finally heading home and into quarantine. Others, already in isolation, endure another day.
And in the heart of China's infected zone, the virus continues to kill. 974 people have died in Hubei province, at least 1,016 across mainland China. The total number of confirmed cases globally now exceeds 42,500, and that number will only grow. Among those new confirmed cases, another Canadian stuck on the quarantine Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan. It has had a sharp spike in infections. At least 136 people are now sick. As Vicadopia explains, some worry if so many people so close together might be a bad idea.
Another medical mayday from the Diamond Princess. Ever since it docked, the number of sick passengers removed from the vessel has been growing. At least 8 Canadian. Those left aboard remain quarantined in their cabins, except for breaks for fresh air and sunshine. Some wondering if they'll be next, like this passenger from Australia.
Some people are concerned that the effects of it, but I think we are overall healthy. So even if we do catch it, we're hoping that will be mild.
The close living quarters on cruise ships make them ripe for the spread of viral illnesses, according to this infectious disease specialist.
With the quarantine in place, hopefully this will reduce the opportunity for infections to be transmitted, but it's not clear now if that quarantine is actually working.
The same could be said of China. As the number of cases surpasses 40,000, the number of foreign cases remains relatively small. But new clusters have appeared in France and the UK from travelers to Asia who hadn't actually been to China. At least one of those sick is reportedly a British doctor, raising the possibility of in-hospital transmissions. A troubling development the WHO is keeping an eye on.
The detection of this small number of cases could be the spark that becomes a bigger fire. But for now, it's only a spark. Our objective remains containment.
And for now, the biggest outbreak outside China appears to be contained, as cruise passengers count down to February 19th, when quarantine is set to end.
I know some other families who because they've got separate rooms with kids, are unable to see their kids, and we're all together. We can see each other. We know we're all safe.
Okay, so Vic, just one of the many families who wants this to end, which won't happen without a breakthrough. I know the WHO is meeting in Geneva tomorrow, but what's on the agenda? Who's there? What are they trying to do?
Well, it's the top researchers in the field from all over the world, including Canada, of course. And they're looking at trying to coordinate their research a bit better to make sure there's no duplication, focus on things like vaccines, and that's going to take months, of course, but other areas that they can focus on, such as a better idea of what sort of therapeutics are needed, faster diagnostics, so they can get a handle on this and treat and diagnose people faster.
Okay, important to watch. This changes every day.
It does.
All right, Vic, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Now, until a vaccine emerges or the outbreak burns itself out, quarantine remains the primary containment option, as 185 people traveling from China will soon learn. A second Canadian charter plane is on its way to CFB Trenton, east of Toronto, after leaving Wuhan earlier today. Its passengers face the same 2 weeks of mandatory isolation as those who returned last week.
Now in China, an extended holiday ended and life was supposed to return to normal. To that end, in the capital, President Xi Jinping stepped out to boost morale. wearing a mask. Xi visited hospital staff and other frontline workers. His message, China will defeat the coronavirus outbreak. But Beijing still looks very much like a city under siege. The streets of this sprawling metropolis, population roughly 8 times that of Toronto, pretty quiet today. Fear and uncertainty clearly still having an effect. At the subway station, typically one of the busiest in the whole system, more security than actual passengers. And with about 330 plus infections, Beijing isn't locked down as tightly as Wuhan, but it is considered one of China's most at-risk cities. And for weeks, people who live there simply haven't gone out unless they've had to. Sasha Petrusik explored what has become a colossal ghost town, still sputtering back to life.
Ride onto the streets of Beijing these days and feel the echoes of an epidemic. Its eerie emptiness. In the middle of a regular day here in the center of Beijing, these streets would be jammed with cars. But ever since this virus arrived, well, see for yourself. Beijing's avenues this desolate for weeks. Its old backstreet hutongs barren. Empty subways, empty malls, empty airport, closed schools. More than 20 million live here in one of the world's megacities. But life is on hold behind the barricades of every housing complex. It's getting a little uncomfortable being stuck here, says Zhang Jinggang, who spends his time learning how to cook, dumplings mostly. But it's safer to stay at home, he says. Too much coronavirus. Those who don't hide away face checkpoints and temperature screenings. Officials looking for the telltale signs of disease, high fever. Neighbors have also been known to report each other if they suspect infection. And then, as in many videos uploaded to the internet, teams of suited police come to enforce quarantine. Is that the best solution?
We don't have anything else to offer at present.
Ian Lipkin is an American epidemiologist who's advising the Chinese government on how to stop coronavirus.
I would say the only thing you have is isolation. And unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be voluntary. It's difficult.
Out in the streets of Beijing, there are those who don't accept that. Zhao Saijin plays outside with his daughter. This virus can't be prevented, he says. If we're going to get it, we'll get it. We can't have the whole country locked inside. And yet, 3 weeks since the crisis started, much of it still is. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Beijing.
And one final note, the WHO's advanced team of experts is now on the ground in Beijing, led by Canada's Dr. Bruce Aylward, who had previously helped lead the international response to the Ebola crisis.
Well, let's turn now to a story sparking protests across the country. Hereditary chiefs on the Wet'suwet'en territory in northern BC are trying to block the Coastal GasLink pipeline project. The RCMP started arresting people last week and then began pockets of protest across Canada. In Calgary, protesters blocked Reconciliation Bridge near downtown. In Winnipeg, they rallied inside Portage Place Mall. East of Toronto, they blocked train tracks, forcing Via Rail to cancel several trips.
A lot of us need to go back home to work, and we're just stuck here.
And near Montreal, a similar scene, a blockade on CP tracks that run through a Mohawk community.
We are here right now because we're always put in a position where we're the ones getting the short end of the stick.
And several protests targeted politicians. This one inside the Department of Justice in Ottawa. And this one at Memorial University's Signal Hill campus within earshot of the federal natural resources minister. But the largest protests happened in British Columbia. Dozens of people blocking access to the Port of Vancouver and hundreds more taking to the streets. Tina Lovegreen takes us there.
When Wet'suwet'en is under attack, what do we do?
They stood their ground despite repeated warnings from police.
The Vancouver police will arrest and remove any person who violates this court order.
Officers moved in, arresting 43 people, some carried out in the arms of officers. but none were charged.
Who do you think you are? Aren't you tired of feeling ashamed of yourselves?
Demonstrators say they support Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who want to keep the project out of their territory, despite approval by the province and support from 20 elected chiefs.
You are not following hereditary chiefs' laws. You are not following your own laws.
After 4 days, Port of Vancouver officials asked the court to intervene, BC's premier saying it was necessary.
I respect everyone's right to lawful protest, but when you're interfering with the operation of the economy at the ports and through the city here in the Lower Mainland, I think that becomes a challenge, and that's why injunctions were granted.
At a Wet'suwet'en camp today, more arrests. A filmmaker inside the police cordon with the Wet'suwet'en captured the arrest of hereditary chiefs. The freelancer has been at the camp for months, sharing his footage with pipeline opponents. News of those arrests sparked another protest through downtown Vancouver this afternoon. This is the second demonstration here in Vancouver. They've disrupted traffic, and it's just one of many across the province. And at the legislature, much the same. And nearby, a small group put their message on display. Demonstrators vowing to continue disruptions. Tina Lovegreen, CBC News, Vancouver.
In the U.S., Democrats are set for their first primary tomorrow, the next step in choosing a presidential candidate to face Donald Trump. Katie Simpson is in New Hampshire, where candidates are attacking Trump and increasingly each other.
You will all have a special place in the hearts of the Bidens.
Dr. Jill Biden is trying to rally the troops on her husband Joe's behalf. Meeting with volunteers in Manchester, New Hampshire, Biden insists the former vice president is still in this race.
Well, he's feeling strong. You know, the people of New Hampshire know Joe.
Biden suffered a deeply disappointing fourth-place finish in Iowa, a stunning result given his national frontrunner status. His campaign has now turned negative, targeting former Mayor Pete Buttigieg in a scathing attack ad.
Under threat of a nuclear Iran, Joe Biden helped to negotiate the Iran deal. And under threat of disappearing pets, Buttigieg negotiated lighter licensing regulations on pet chip scanners.
It's nothing out of the ordinary in politics, according to Biden.
No, I'm not concerned about internal fighting. You know, in the end, we are going to support whoever the nominee is.
Though to some, it's a sign of desperation.
It's the point at which a campaign has to really look at the facts on the ground. And if you're not doing the way you'd like to be doing, you need to try something different, and that usually means going negative.
Any perception of infighting is welcome news to supporters of President Donald Trump, who waited in the rain for hours to get a seat at his New Hampshire rally.
I think it's a bit of a mess. I said you can see the division amongst their own party, and I think they're kind of imploding within, and I just think it's a mess.
I think Bernie, but it depends if the Democrats ruin him this time or not. But I can't see any of them beating Trump.
Heading into tomorrow's vote, Senator Bernie Sanders has a clear lead in the polls, followed by former Mayor Pete Buttigieg. But it's Joe Biden who has the most on the line. If he doesn't have a strong showing here, it's going to be hard for his campaign to pick up momentum. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Manchester, New Hampshire.
And ahead, you'll hear more about Bernie Sanders as Paul Hunter gets a close-up view of the Democratic scramble in New Hampshire.
Why Bernie?
Well, no, the question is why not Bernie? Why would we go anywhere else at this point?
An Oscar-winning supporters' take on what's fueling Bernie and much more. That's later in the show.
An Ottawa federal office complex is being tested after years of mysterious illnesses. There are roaches and there are bats flapping overhead. There are droppings raining down on cubicles. But, as Amanda Pfeffer explains, they might not even be the main problem.
I have seen Japanese cockroaches.
Sophie Lavoie has not been working long at the federal complex, but long enough to know her cockroaches.
I took a picture, and with the app I was able to identify the bug that was walking on the desk.
The federal government commissioned air quality tests. All but 20 of the 260 workers surveyed reported some symptom. 1 in 10 reported being treated for a respiratory illness. 1 in 20 reported an immune system-related illness. Last fall, one of their unions circulated a petition to tell government the situation is urgent. The union released this video, a bat flying above the heads of workers. Bats and their droppings have been a problem for years. Dr. Jennifer Armstrong has treated some of the workers at the Terrasse de la Chaudière, and she says the biggest culprit is likely not the bats.
I would say all of the symptoms you just mentioned could come from mold.
Dr. Armstrong says the clue is in the survey itself, where a third of workers say they have seen visible signs of water damage. But mold is not being tested until next summer. And some worry that bureaucracy may be getting in the way of a more rapid response.
The problem is that it takes so much thinking, it takes so much funds, it takes so much efforts that it's easier to fix what is in front of us, what is the most pressing, and let the bigger picture be put aside.
The big picture, daunting for this worker on her very first day.
Well, I mean, it's not something you want to read when you're starting in a new ministry. Hey, by the way, there's bats that may fly over your head. Welcome to the office, I guess.
The parliamentary secretary for the minister responsible is telling workers that this ongoing testing is supposed to help identify the problems so that they can fix them as quickly as possible. Amanda Pfeffer, CBC News, Ottawa.
Hollywood history last night when Oscar's top prize went to an outsider.
대학생인 척하라는 거야? 구라를 좀 치지 뭐.
Up next, we look at Parasite's win and whether it sets the stage for others.
It actually make the awards, the Oscars, more relevant again.
Plus, Canadian farmers speak out after suffering in silence.
I started to have panic attacks at night.
And Alex, what is a tick off the bucket list? Wait until you hear her journey to Jeopardy.
It really is coming full circle.
We're back in 2.
Parasite is being celebrated today, coming off an incredible night at the Oscars. It took home 4 Academy Awards, including the big one, Best Picture. And as Zuleka Nathu shows us, that history-making moment might also be a big win for representation.
In the heart of LA's Koreatown, one of the largest Korean communities in North America, store owner Gina Mitchell can't stop thinking about last night's big win.
I thought it's my ear something wrong. So it was a Koreatown. So many people, they going crazy.
Parasite. When Parasite won Best Picture, it made history. It's the first non-English language film to take the category in the Oscars' 92 years. It also took home 3 others: Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best International Feature.
대학생인 척하라는 거야? 구라를 좀 치지 뭐.
The thriller focuses on the codependent and increasingly troubling relationship between a wealthy family and one living in poverty. Backstage at the Dolby Theatre after the win, Parasite director Bong Joon-ho said he never set out to change the industry, but telling stories with a universal theme has the power to unite audiences. Through a translator, he said he believes film is borderless.
If we pursue the beauty of cinema and focus on the individual charms that each piece has, I think then we will naturally overcome all these barriers.
The filmmaker is well known in Korea for his gritty take on social themes. Kyung Kim is an expert in Asian studies and film.
This is a theme of empathy that a lot of people recognize all over the world.
After this date, not the best.
Canadian actor Paul Sung-hyung Lee of Kim's Convenience says the victory over films like 1917 and The Irishman is a big step for representation on screen.
Actually make the awards, the Oscars, more relevant again, and to be a shining light for the rest of the world to show that, yes, we do celebrate cinema at its finest, no matter where it's from.
Thank you very much. A milestone for Asian communities, but also for the Academy. Its efforts over the years to diversify its membership might be paying off. Zuleika Nathu, CBC News, Los Angeles.
So, great night for Parasite, but a pretty abysmal one for Oscar ratings. This year, they fell to an all-time low, down 20% from last year, which beats out the previous low set in 2018. Critics complained the show was too long, too random, and not entertaining enough.
Among the other stories we're following tonight, police in Ontario have recovered the bodies of a father and his 4-year-old daughter who died on the weekend. Kira Kagan and Robin Brown went on a hike yesterday afternoon at a conservation area in Milton. That's about an hour west of Toronto. Police were called hours later when they hadn't returned. That sparked a massive search and rescue operation, which ended late last night.
There were significant trauma on the victims that could be consistent with a fall.
The case is not currently being considered a homicide, but because of the age of the little girl, it's protocol to have the homicide unit lead the investigation. A Winnipeg police officer was sent to hospital following a high-speed police chase through the streets of the city last night.
Looks like he's passed a couple cruisers, just rammed a cruiser car.
The whole thing was recorded by a police helicopter. Officials say the suspect, a 38-year-old woman, exceeded speeds of 100 kilometers per hour through residential neighborhoods. At one point, an officer was pinned to his cruiser. He only suffered minor injuries. The driver is facing several charges, including assault and possession of stolen property. And it seems Masai Ujiri, as well as the Toronto Raptors, are being sued for an incident after the team won the NBA championship in June. So the case involves this altercation between Ujiri and California Sheriff's Deputy Alan Strickland. The lawsuit alleges the Raptors president failed to show the on-court credentials, which led to a scuffle that ended with Ujiri allegedly hitting the officer with both fists. Strickland claims he has suffered severe emotional and physical distress since the clash. The team calls the claims baseless and entirely without merit.
Well, up next, an Alberta First Nations fight to bring home their precious artifacts. Those artifacts have been sitting in a British museum for more than a century now. Tonight, though, a sign of progress.
And later, dangerous winds flooded streets, downed trees. Storm Kiara battles Europe. We'll be right back. Welcome back. An Alberta First Nation is trying to get some important artifacts returned home. They once belonged to the revered Blackfoot leader, Chief Crowfoot. But as Aaron Collins explains, an English museum has been reluctant to give them up.
This story starts on the windswept plains of southern Alberta more than 100 years ago. 7 First Nations gathered here at Blackfoot Crossing to sign a treaty with the Crown. Among them, the Siksika chief, Crowfoot.
He represents Siksika Nation and who we are. It's part of our identity.
This site now home to this historical park, operated by the Siksika Band, a showcase for Blackfoot culture. But something is missing. Sacred ceremonial regalia once worn by Crowfoot, absent for more than a century.
That's what we believe he was wearing when they signed the treaty, which is why that's the significance of it as well. You know, having that come home is almost like it's having like a full circle of his return.
To uncover the story of where Crowfoot's possessions have been, you have to travel to the other side of the Atlantic. Shortly after Crowfoot signed Treaty 7, his ceremonial regalia wound up here at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter, either on display or here in the museum stores ever since.
Wow.
But now there's a campaign to bring those artifacts home and display them there. So far, the local council that owns the museum here has said, not yet. Officials say they worry if the artifacts are returned, will they be properly cared for?
And that the place where they're going to be displayed actually is properly run and managed and has the right equipment for conserving the items.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has weighed in, writing a letter to officials in the UK saying that bar has been met, urging them to repatriate the artifacts, saying it would be a great act of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people. One recipient of that letter, the UK's former Secretary of Culture and the MP for Exeter. Is the UK doing enough to get these colonial artifacts back where they came from?
I think we can always do more. We're doing better than we did, and we've certainly taken a policy and a moral decision that it is right in certain circumstances to repatriate.
So there is reason for optimism. The UK is reviewing how it deals with colonial artifacts like these. A decision to return this regalia could happen as soon as July. The end of a long journey home for Chief Crowfoot's belongings, returning them to his final resting place and giving this story a fitting ending. Aaron Collins, CBC News, London.
Well, next, for many farmers, opening up about mental health struggles is hard, but it can lead to some pretty powerful moments.
He said, I'd like to thank you. And we said, well, why? And he said, you just saved my life. I'm going to go home and talk to my wife.
The people using their personal pain to start a difficult conversation in Canada's farming communities. We'll be right back. Mental health issues don't discriminate. It doesn't matter where you live in this country, what your income is, or your sex. By age 40, about half of Canadians will either have a mental illness or have had one in the past. Think depression, anxiety, PTSD, and more. And yet, talking about it is still so hard. So, all this week, the National is having that conversation with people who are confronting stigma to help themselves and others. We start on the prairies, where Nick Purdon met with a group whose struggles often fly under the radar: farmers.
Winter's definitely tough, especially out here on the prairies, because there's snow and cold and not a lot of people around. It's when a lot of thoughts go sideways in your head, it seems like to me.
Sean Stanford farms in southern Alberta, as his parents and grandparents did before him. But what's different about Sean is that he's one of the first farmers in the country to speak openly about his mental health.
If I hadn't have gotten help, I don't know if I'd be here today, honestly. I'm not saying I'm a suicidal person necessarily, but you start to get in some dark places when you don't know what's going on inside of yourself.
Sean is by no means alone. Canadian farmers have extremely high levels of stress, depression, and burnout, and the occupation has one of the highest suicide rates. And these are the people who feed us. Are we taking them for granted? Do we ever even think about their struggles?
You're trying to do everything right you can, and you have no idea what's going to happen. Just something's going to fall out of the sky. Either it's going to be rain and it'll be good, or it could be hail, it could be bad. It's a high dollar risk game. It's like going to Vegas and betting thousands of dollars per roll. You never know what the outcome's going to be.
The uncontrollable nature of the job has hit Sean hard, and a few years ago it came to a head. His crops weren't good, the bills were piling up, and there was more work than he could handle. Sean tried to keep going, but in the end he broke down.
I was in bed, and it just felt like a crushing weight on my chest. And my arm was sore. It felt like every sign of a heart attack that I've ever read before. I thought I was going to die. I thought, well, my family's going to be without me, and they're going to be in even worse shape. So until I actually found an answer of what was wrong, it was petrifying.
When the doctors told Sean that what he thought was a heart attack was actually anxiety, that created another problem. A heart attack you can talk about. Anxiety, as a farmer, not so much.
Farmers are supposed to be, salt of the earth, strong people who don't need help from anybody, and they're supposed to just carry on no matter what happens to them. But I've come to realize that asking for help is not a bad thing, and knowing that you're not alone is a huge help.
Desperate for help, Sean reached out online and he found Leslie Kelly. She runs a grain farm near Saskatoon with her husband, Matt. Now, Leslie had recently co-founded the first ever mental health organization aimed at farmers.
In agriculture, we always hear about, the latest advancements in technology and innovation, and we forgot about our people. And I think the greatest opportunity that we have in agriculture is our people and ensuring that our people are healthy.
Leslie sensed that farmers were far from it. But it wasn't until she rented a hall in Edmonton and invited farmers to come talk about their mental health that she saw the full extent of the problem.
There were about 400 seats in that room, and I thought, if a dozen people come, that will be so great. And when they opened the doors, the farmers, they flooded in, and you could not find an empty chair in that room. People were they were sitting in the aisles, and they were standing along the back. And we asked the question, if you know of someone who has died by suicide, a loved one, a community member, a neighbor, a fellow farmer, and almost that whole entire room stood up, and I cried almost that whole panel.
And then Leslie met someone who showed her just how much she could help.
There was a farmer who was directly across from me. He was standing at the back, and he had his hat down, and he cried the whole time. And afterwards, he came up to us, and once everyone had left, and he said, I'd like to thank you. And we said, well, why? And he said, you just saved my life. I'm going to go home and talk to my wife. And I cried knowing that we should have been talking about this years ago.
I mean, the reason that story hits home for Leslie is the same reason she started working to help farmers with their mental health in the first place. A few years ago, during a tough harvest, her husband Matt had his own mental health breakdown.
Everything was starting to compound. My life, the farm, everything was just starting to balloon, and I was just going round and round in a circle, right? So I started to have panic attacks at night. I would think about one thing would turn into 10 things would turn into 100 things would turn into 1,000, and so on.
What was it like for you to watch Matt go through that?
I would say it almost caused me to have a panic attack because he thought he was dying. He would sweat and not be able to breathe, and where I would have to hold on him so tight for him to focus on my breathing to get it to slow down. I remember one day having to take his clothes off because he was sweating so much, and lying him down on the cool floor to get him to cool off. So that, to watch someone you love go through something like that is super hard. One of the hardest things I've ever had to do.
Is it down there?
Where do you drive? Where does Daddy drive?
Where do you ride?
With Leslie's help, Matt is doing much better. And now the couple works together promoting mental health for farmers across the country. And Sean Stanford tries to help other farmers too. He knows what it takes to get healthy, and he shares his experience whenever he can.
Most days I feel something, a little bit of stress of some kind. But I've found a lot of different mechanisms to help me with it. So I'm on some medications that I take every day. That's really helped level me out. Before I would get home, have supper, go back to work. Now I'll stay and play with the kids and have more quality time to help my brain decompress after a day of work.
Sean's journey hasn't been easy. He still gets messages telling him that a real farmer would just suck it up. He says he tried that, but the stakes are too high.
What I was doing wasn't working and something needed to change. And I'm glad getting help is what the change was, rather than abandoning the farm, abandoning my family, abandoning everything I've known. So it was the right choice to get help so I could continue everything I've been working on my whole life, rather than change directions and run away.
A healthy country needs healthy farmers. We can't really afford to look the other way. Nick Purdon, CBC News, McGrath, Alberta.
Now, clearly, it can be hard for some men to ask for help when they're struggling with their mental health. But a BC-based website called Heads Up Guys is trying to ease that. Behind it, a man who knows all about it firsthand.
I didn't even really realize that I was like trying to man up or trying to like be tough, but it was just a part of me, like, oh, I have to figure this out on my own. I have to solve this.
Tomorrow, how Josh Beharry went from being hopeless to being driven to help, and the very real impact that website is having. And if you need to talk about your mental health concerns, or if you know someone else who does, Crisis Services Canada and Kids Help Phone are there to help. You can call them, text with them, or chat with them online.
Next, we head back to New Hampshire on the eve of a crucial vote for Democrats.
Let's win here. Let's defeat Trump. Let's transform this country.
So Bernie Sanders looks like the favorite, but is he really the party's best hope to defeat Donald Trump? That's right after the break.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, as the fight over a natural gas pipeline in northern BC continues to escalate, what comes next for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders? Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Dream big, fight hard, and win.
I will restore dignity to the White House.
Tomorrow could begin the end of Donald Trump.
What a puzzle. The person Democrats want to beat Trump on the 2020 ballot is still a mystery going into the New Hampshire primary. Some frontrunners are now lagging, one straggler now surging. But in New Hampshire, polls suggest the guy to beat is Bernie Sanders.
And the reason
by Election Day, Sanders will be 79 years old. He's already had a heart attack on the campaign trail. But after the chaos of the Iowa caucuses, as the party looks to New Hampshire for some sign of clarity, Paul Hunter shows us right now Bernie is where the buzz is.
For those who've somehow missed it, in politically crazed New Hampshire, right now he's the favorite, Bernie Sanders.
What's different about him is that he really supports the people that might be like tired of the status quo.
It's an election season like no other in a generation. For so many Americans, it's not about who you want to put in, but who you want to kick out. So you know it. The other side's here too. Healthcare is right. Which gets us to the big question dogging Bernie. Is America ready for a self-described democratic socialist? On this night, supporters of all the remaining Democratic candidates have turned out for a night of pre-primary speeches. And when Sanders comes out, a key part of his appeal is that he's bang on message.
4 years ago, we said that health care is a human right, not a privilege.
Most Americans feel like
2 nights earlier, Democratic debate night in New Hampshire, and Sanders supporters gather for a watch party. Their response to the socialism will never win over America argument?
Every poll for the last year has said that he has the best chance of beating Trump.
Trump calls him a communist.
Trump calls a lot of people a lot of things.
Amid the Bernie backers, a high-profile supporter.
Bernie is the person who's going to stop Trump.
Filmmaker Michael Moore, trashing Trump, talking up Sanders.
Why Bernie? Well, no, the question is why not Bernie? Why would we go anywhere else at this point? In order to beat Trump, in order to have this country behave the way it should behave, to where nobody has to worry about getting sick and losing their home, go down the whole list of things. Why not Bernie?
It's a point Sanders underlines again that night on TV.
What Medicare for All will do is save the average American substantial sums of money.
Emphasizing, as he does, his ideas aren't radical, they're necessary and urgent. As we watch, we're told Michael Moore wants to tell us more.
If we just put up the same old, we're not going to inspire young people. We're not going to inspire people of color to come out there and do the job that needs to be done. No, I'm sorry. No 29-year-old is going to wake up on Election Day and go, I can't wait to vote for Joe Biden. It's just not going to happen.
Hey, everybody, how are you?
Former Vice President Joe Biden is widely seen as the safe choice, the so-called moderate in the push to oust Trump. Here, rallying campaign volunteers before they all go door to door.
The reports of our death are premature.
Though some wonder if troubles loom. Then there's the new kid on the political block, the one with the weird last name. With buzz on Pete Buttigieg building, check the monster lineup for a rally at a New Hampshire college Saturday, snaking through the lobby. And by the way, he's got his own star power. Actor Michael J. Fox, Alberta-born, now a dual citizen, likes what he sees in Buttigieg.
I believe he's got the ability and the temperament and the intelligence to get past this current divisive, dysfunctional politics.
And when Buttigieg himself takes the stage, the optics underline that.
Aren't you ready to put that chaos behind us? Aren't you ready to put the corruption behind us?
Say Buttigieg backers, what the country needs is a breather.
We go too far to the left and we go too far to the right. At some point, somebody has to bring us back to center, and that's why I like Pete. I really think he can bring the country together.
The knock on Bernie supporters here at a training session for volunteers has been that if Sanders is not the nominee, that they won't vote for anyone come the presidential election, and that indirectly helps Trump. Not this time, we're told.
I would vote for anyone to get Trump out of office.
We've just got to beat the guy in the White House. Whoever comes to the top, I'll vote for him. There's just no alternative for me.
Still, Bernie's their guy for now. And so, on a wintry morning in New Hampshire, off they go, trying to make it happen. But here's another thing about U.S. politics in the age of Trump. Take nothing for granted. Here at the Tumble-In Diner in Claremont, what matters is what you say, who you are. In 2016, this part of the country backed both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Don't believe it?
Yeah, I'd vote for Bernie. I'd vote for Bernie. I like Bernie, yeah.
And you voted Trump last time?
Yeah.
And so it's into this. The leading candidate in the New Hampshire primary sent his message. Think about the country you could have, he urges. Forget the fear-mongering and remember that other lesson from 2016. Voting actually matters.
Now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. Now is the time to get involved. Please come out on Tuesday. Let's win here. Let's defeat Trump. Let's transform this country. Thank you all, Claremont.
It's Bernie's unspoken mantra. Trust him for the big job, he says. It's time. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Claremont, New Hampshire.
Okay, let's turn now to some of the other stories we are following. A powerful storm battered much of northwest Europe. Waves pummeled the coast of northern France, where winds reached 139 kilometers an hour. In Britain, more than 200 flood warnings were issued, and some areas saw streets turned into rivers, a real concern for safety if flood defenses had failed. The storm also wreaked havoc on transportation networks as hundreds of flights got canceled. Others were diverted as strong winds made for a pretty harrowing experience for travelers. Thailand continues to mourn after 29 people were killed over the weekend in the country's worst mass shooting. Thousands gathered to remember victims of Saturday's shooting rampage northeast of Bangkok. At least 50 others were injured when a rogue soldier went on a nearly 16-hour shooting spree, ultimately ending when he was shot dead by military personnel early Sunday morning. The U.S. is charging 4 members of the Chinese military in connection with the 2017 data breach of Equifax.
The scale of the theft was staggering. The hackers obtained the names, birth dates, and social security numbers of nearly 150 million Americans.
The breach also affected the accounts of nearly 20,000 Canadians and hundreds of thousands of Britons. 4 Beijing residents are accused of computer fraud, economic espionage, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud.
Next on The National, watching Jeopardy helped this woman learn English. Now she's a contestant. Our moment is next. When Christina Ng immigrated to Canada, she was bound and determined to learn English, and what better teacher than watching hours of the show Jeopardy! 3 decades later, she met her tutor, Alex Trebek, when she became a contestant on the show. The trivia whiz and her journey of Jeopardy! Is our moment.
When I was 8 years old, I immigrated to Canada from southern China. I did not speak a word of English. Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy! Was the soundtrack of my life.
This is Jeopardy!
So every night I would practice. Jeopardy! Was part of my study to be integrated into Canadian society. So I got called at the end of October to say, hey, this is a Jeopardy! Contestant coordinator, you've been selected. I could not believe it. The lights, the sounds, seeing the clue board. It really is coming full circle, and what a journey it has been to be on the same stage as Alex Trebek, a great Canadian. That is just something I could never imagine.
And this story is hard to imagine. Her appearance, by the way, is later this week.
Right.
But when she says she got a phone call, it's not so simple. There is an online process. So
Right,
you have
yeah,
to
yeah.
write an online test. And then if you pass the test, it's a big if, you might get an invitation to a regional audition in Seattle. Then you have to wait some 18 months to find out if you're in. And that only happens with that phone call.
I couldn't do it.
I know.
I couldn't do it. No,
I've never been
even if I thought I was smart enough to do it, I couldn't. It would just be so terrifying. Yet the risk of looking like an idiot to all of the I don't know.
We just call that Tuesday.
That's the National for this February 10th. Have a good night.
Good night.